Sometimes classroom discussion feels less like a lively exchange of ideas and more like a hostage negotiation with 27 people who have collectively agreed to stare at the floor. You ask a question that every student should know by now because you covered it in the lecture, assigned it in the reading, and even assessed it. Practically a post it note on their desk. And yet, crickets. But the 10 instructors in this episode figured out something the rest of us keep having to relearn. Better class discussion does not start with a better question. It starts way before that. Welcome to the What and Who of EDU, the show where educators and thought leaders join us to share their strategies and stories straight from today's classroom. Whether you're looking to boost student confidence, build belonging, navigate new teaching challenges, or figure out where AI fits in, we're here with clear, actionable ideas that you can use right away. I'm your host, Marissa Bluestone, and today we're here to discuss how instructors get students talking to you and to each other, not just nodding politely at the front of the room. Let's get into it. Tip 1. Small groups make big discussions safer. Dr. Jennifer Ripley Stickle, a teaching professor and non-majors biology program director at West Virginia University, teaches 250 students at a time. She's turned class participation into a game show where the lifeline is already built in and the answers are a group effort. And while not a new car, the prize is still highly coveted. A sticker.
I always have my students work in small groups to jot down their ideas on physical paper. And these physical papers are turned into me. They are not graded. They are simple participation point in class activity papers. After the students have had a moment to discuss with each other, I give them about 2 to 3 minutes. I then walk around and have students volunteer to report their group's answers. And again, they are reporting their group's answers. So it could have been anyone in their group that came up with these ideas. They are just the reporter, which kind of takes some of the pressure off the fact that it's their idea being correct or incorrect. And I go around and I give stickers to all my reporters because I want a format. So I teach very large lecture classes, 250 students, and I want them to get some type of recognition for participating in class. It is a big thing to participate in a 250 seat lecture class. So I consider it your helmet in football. I give them a sticker every time they report, even if it's not their own answer. And they collect these stickers on a folder and they turn them in at the end of the semester. And I have a rubric for the stickers. The stickers have no point value. I don't have to record participation, but I know my own stickers. I buy them a certain style. And these stickers just encourage participation. And at the end of the semester, if their grade is borderline, but they've participated 5 times, then they get moved up to the next grade level. So it's a very non-threatening way to earn extra points.
There are stickers, not metaphorical stickers, actual stickers on a folder in a university lecture hall with a rubric. 0 point value, and yet somehow that is exactly what makes it work. Tip 2. Pause to write. Sometimes the room goes quiet because students are blank. Not resistant, not checked out, just blank, because the question arrived before the thought did. That is why the advice of Dr. Dave Myers, one of the most widely read psychology authors in the world, is so smart. He pauses class and invites students to write before asking them to contribute.
So there's lots of ideas for sparking better conversations, but one that was recommended to me by a master teacher of psychology and that I think works splendidly well is not just to invite discussion, but rather to pause the class, to invite people to write for a minute in response to some question, and then having written, to invite people to contribute what they've written. And now lots of people have something to say because they've collected a thought. And so you don't just get blank stares when you invite a question. And by the way, other instructors will pause and ask people to think about the question. But I sort of like the idea of the pause to write. Interrupt the class, invite people to write for 1 minute their thoughts in response to a question, and then welcome people's contributions of what they've been thinking and writing. And you'll have many more people with something to say than you otherwise would.
A blank stare has nowhere to go. A half-written sentence? Well, that does. Dr. Myers did not reinvent the discussion. He just gave it something to stand on before asking it to run. Tip 3. Give them a way in. Dr. Sarah Lehman, a professor of biology and STEM outreach coordinator at the University of Mount Olive, has a 3-part approach. 1, find out what students actually care about. 2, connect the material to that. And 3, do the one thing that every instinct in your body will push against, and that's to wait.
I like to know my students' interests. We are an institution that has such a wide variety of students in every class. It would be impossible for us just to have a class that was solidly just pre-med majors or something like that. So I like to find out what's interesting to them and tailor examples or ask questions and try to relate the material to what's going to spark their interest. I also like framing my questions more around discussions rather than yes or no, right or wrong answers, just finding out where they are and giving them a little bit of time to kind of formulate their answers and maybe reframing the question a little bit, because we always get that crickets moment of silence where they're just kind of looking at me like, what are you asking here? And it's like, okay, well, let's think about it this way, and giving them a different example. And then just letting them know their thoughts are okay, right? However they're synthesizing the material, I want to know where they're at. I want to know where they're coming from and how they're putting all of this together. And that's not wrong, but I can't see where to go next unless they're being honest in that discussion.
In other words, she's not trying to trap students into the right answer, but she is trying to see how they are putting the material together. And once students know their thoughts are okay, the conversation gets a whole lot more honest. Tip 4. Start with the headline, Curiosity Needs a Door In. Dr. Ryan Herzog, economics author and an associate professor of economics at Gonzaga University, has heard the same thing from basically every former student he runs into. I wish I had paid more attention. This stuff is everywhere now. The material was relevant the whole time. They just couldn't see it yet. So now he starts class with the things students already half know, half heard, and would love to better understand.
I mean, this has always been one of those challenges that we have with our students. Inevitably, when I meet students that have graduated or parents of students, and they hear I teach economics, the response is always, "Oh, I wish I had paid more attention to when I was in that class because it's so relevant to everything I do today." So that challenge on us to get students to engage in material that they may not connect with when they're 18, 19, 20 years old is certainly there. Today, it's been nice because there's lots of headlines that tie into economics that we can talk about. And so my biggest thing is always just starting class with an open conversation about current events. We've had, especially if you're teaching macro, but certainly even in the micro space, enough events unfold over the last 5 years to have conversations. And that also then builds their kind of general curiosity around the why and what's the effects of it, right? Obviously, with the Iranian war going on right now and the oil crisis that's unfolding. Lots of questions around how does this impact the economy? How does this impact households? So some of the kind of pluses of engaging this conversation is students are now seeing these events impact their own lives more directly than maybe in the past.
Make no mistake, there was always something with a version of, wait, does this affect me? Inside of it. The question is the doorway. Dr. Herzog just opens it first. Tip 5. Make it feel like real life. Pressure drops when discussion stops feeling like a quiz. Betsy Langness, the psychology department head at Jefferson Community and Technical College, teaches fully online. She knows that a discussion board can feel like homework, dressed up in a trench coat, pretending to be a conversation, and that students can smell it through the Wi-Fi. So she asks students to connect course ideas to something they've seen, noticed, or lived.
One thing that I try to do to spark a good conversation is to make it feel less like an assignment and try to make it feel like a real conversation. Instead of asking students to like summarize a chapter or tell me all about this content, I want them to connect it to something they've actually seen in their life. Um, whether it's their job, their family, something on social media, or in academia. If they can make that connection with something, I think it sparks a better conversation because they're more curious about it. And I also like to remind them that this is a discussion. There is no right or wrong answer. We're really just thinking aloud about these concepts. And so that kind of takes some of the pressure off of the conversations and really lets them be more thoughtful and a lot more human when it comes to discussions.
Nobody posts unprompted thoughts about chapters they just read, but they will absolutely tell you about the thing their coworker did that connects to attribution theory. Give students the real-world hook and then get out of the way. Tip 6. Ditch the post twice purgatory. Low stakes first, and then the real conversation comes. If you teach online, you already know the classic discussion board formula. Post once, reply twice. Watch nobody have an actual conversation. Jennifer Duncan, Associate Professor of English at Georgia State University's Perimeter College, is so very over it.
So I teach online, which means that getting students to talk with me is really difficult. Getting students to talk with each other is almost impossible. So one of the things I think that we have to do is get rid of that old post once, reply twice model for discussions that people used to do 10 and 15 years ago, to realize the artificiality of that and to put students in conversations they actually want to have before we start putting them in conversations that maybe we need for them to have. So I talk a lot about the need for low stakes or no stakes play spaces for students to have conversations with each other, to literally show their face. I've got a lot of weekly check-ins where I ask students to do something that shows their face, whether it's them drinking a cup of tea while showing their face, or whether it's they're reading today's content with a British accent to show their face, because I want them to start seeing that there are other people in this class and that we're humans. And I think when that happens, my hypothesis is when it comes time to talk about the work, we all feel a little more comfortable because it's not just a bunch of disembodied names coming up on a screen. These are real people that we realize we're learning with. It's my hope for what will spark better conversations, better class discussions. And that may be idealistic, but it's what I'm going to go with right now. I'm going to go with humanizing my classroom in any way I can in order to make people understand that a conversation doesn't have to equal a grade. A conversation can just be a way to get to know each other and learn together.
In other words, pure conversation needs a pregame. Nobody walks into a karaoke and opens with their emotional power ballad. Tip 7. Lead the question, then let them talk. Dr. Erica Martinez, a professor of instruction at the University of South Florida, does not treat discussion like a bonus activity after the lecture is over. She reserves part of the class, around 10 to 20%, for group work and student-to-student learning. Because sometimes the best way to understand an idea is to hear how someone sitting 2 feet away is making sense of it.
It depends what class I'm teaching, right? So some classes, if I'm teaching a theory course, we can't do the same things as when I'm teaching a lighter elective, right? Sometimes I am more interested and you have more freedom to give your opinion, but you can't give your opinion on the first welfare theorem of economics. So there's this level of discussion that can take place in different classrooms and on another level that can take place in others. I always lecture to some degree in my classrooms, and I use the Socratic method. So probing questions every step of the way and allowing space for linking concepts that we did last week. So as I introduce a new concept, I'll ask a question that is leading for sure, but it sparks a little bit of conversation and a little bit of discussion. I sometimes like flipping the classroom, but flipping the classroom is very dependent on who's in your classroom. So if I have a class where I have a lot of first gen students who have big demands on their time outside of the classroom, or I know a lot of my students are working full time or even a lot of them part time, I can't flip the classroom in the same way when I have a class where at the University of South Florida, it's very quintessential American culture student. They're there living their best undergraduate life and they have more time and flexibility outside of the classroom than when I'm teaching at a community college per se, and the students have different needs. And so flipping the classroom is a great way to spark discussion because I can move a lot of that lecture time ahead of class, outside of class, and then ask them to read an article and have a deeper discussion for a longer period in the classroom. At the very least, I like to reserve usually at least some 10 to 20% of class time for group work so that they are getting some discussion amongst themselves and I'm walking around the classroom and I can hear and interact with them, and they get a lot of peer instruction during that period, conversing with each other, which then also feeds back to the lecture time. They're more comfortable talking with each other and more comfortable talking with me. So then that Socratic method of lecture works much, much better than it would when I don't do those small breakout group discussions.
So, yes to leading questions, yes to peer conversation, yes to walking the room and listening. And none of that is a shortcut. That is how the engine actually turns over. Good discussions don't generate themselves and sometimes need jumper cables, and Dr. Martinez knows exactly where to put them. Tip 8. Wrong is not the same as incorrect. The word choice matters. Dr. Dan Look, the Charles A. Dana Professor of Mathematics at St. Lawrence University and author of Math Cats, teaches the subject where students walk in absolutely convinced there is one right answer and everything else is failure. And they've been trained to believe this since 2nd grade. He's trying to introduce a third category.
Something I've been saying this semester, which doesn't fully make sense, but the no wrong answers is what I say a lot. Now in math, students obviously feel there is definitely a right answer. And so I'm trying to distinguish in the students' minds the difference between a wrong answer and an incorrect answer. Incorrect answer is one thing, but if you're answering and participating and thinking, I feel like the term wrong is way stronger than what we mean, right? Wrong puts on it some kind of mistake. You should not have done that. Whereas incorrect is slightly gentler. And so reminding them that you're not being graded on this, things might be not accurate, but you might say the thing that sparks this other student to connect an idea and realize what's going on. You're still contributing even if you didn't solve the problem.
Wrong carries a verdict. Incorrect just carries a correction. Essentially, it's the difference between a student who tries and a student who goes quiet and stays quiet. Tip 9. Start small, think Seen. Build discussions students feel safe joining. Some instructors go all in on engagement. Full simulations, elaborate role play, immersive semester-long activities that deserve their own prep team. Dr. Krista Moreau, an educational research associate at the Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning, knows that two things are true. First, that it's so critical for students to recognize themselves in the material, and also that it's nearly impossible to do that for every single assignment.
I think it's important to think about who your audience is. And because I've had small class sizes, I'm really able to hone in on that. For me, teaching exclusively neurodivergent students and thinking about their disability identity has been something that is really important to have representation of folks with disabilities, even if it's not a neurodivergent individual. There's a lot of overlap between the physical disability community and the barriers that they have and the neurodivergent community. And that's a lesson that I want my students to see. Sparking discussions in classrooms and connecting students to content that they care about is kind of the holy grail of education. And I think it's really important that educators think about not having to do that for every single assignment. It's exhausting to say, oh, I have to have my entire semester built out with these immersive or represented examples. And so I would say start small and think about individual assignments that you can create. The one in particular that I was talking about, I interviewed someone who has a physical disability who's a scientist, and it was so cool how the students connected with it, but then also how much it sparked other conversations, and I learned things about them that I didn't know. And for me, with the small class sizes and having the students for several semesters, it's actually really shocking that they were telling me things that I didn't know about them and that they were comfortable enough to share in that deeper level. But again, it's not to say that every single assignment has that, because I think that that's really, really important to highlight. You can't do it for everything. You can't be everything.
Dr. Monroe is not asking for a full redesign. She's asking for one assignment, one interview, one example, one moment where a student thinks, that's someone like me. Tip 10. Break the ice on purpose. Day 1 sets everything. Some people hear icebreaker and immediately develop a mysterious scheduling conflict. Dr. Star Sinclair, an assistant professor of psychology at Florida Gulf Coast University, is unbothered because she knows that if students walk into class isolated, their heads go down, their phones come out, and discussion may not be so meaningful.
You set the tone early on. So I know the class icebreaker, some people think maybe it's hokey. Some people maybe don't necessarily. They're like, okay, yeah, introductions. But when I say I stand by the class icebreaker as a way to set the tone and to get students immediately locked in as a community, and how that works and sets everything up for the rest of the course, I stand by it. I stand by it. I stand by it. My favorite one is the class bingo icebreaker. I set up a little bingo sheet that has different characteristics about, people, or maybe characteristics that pertain to content in the class. And then I have the students on the very first day go around and introduce themselves and see who has those characteristics. And my rules are, you can't have someone fill out more than one thing. It forces them to actually go and talk to each other. I think so often, especially nowadays, students come into the class and their heads are in their phone, or they immediately open up their laptop. And so even though they're in a space with other people, they actually are still so isolated from other people because they're so focused in on themselves just forcing them sort of out of their little individual bubble for, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it is, that sets such a tone from the get-go that students are able to then say, oh yeah, I met so-and-so on day one and they have 2 fur babies named Felix and Felicity. And students, they start kind of mingling with each other. And then I usually put in 1 or 2 things that are maybe that are characteristics of myself that may be less likely for students, especially traditional students, right? And then I see how long it takes for someone to say, hey, wait, professor, can I ask you to sign off on one of these things? And so then those organic and spontaneous interactions with me, and I'm like, oh, I thought you'd never ask. Yes, I do have children, or whatever, something on there. And then once we do the icebreaker, then I do attendance. And then I go through and I say, hi, Nicole, everybody who got to meet Nicole today for the first time. And then everyone that, who Nicole signed off on something raised their hand. I'd be like, hey, so what did you learn about Nicole? And then the next thing you know is they're talking about each other, with each other. Again, nothing to do with the course content. But when we start to have discussions about course content, we've already broken the ice.
She's setting the tone early, before the first hard conversation, before the first disagreement, before the first awkward silence. The ice is already broken. Hokey? Maybe. Effective? Definitely. Okay, here's what we learned today. Better class discussion is rarely about finding the one perfect prompt. More like crafting the conditions that make talking feel possible. Sometimes that means low-stakes warm-ups. Sometimes it means icebreakers. Sometimes it just means waiting longer than feels comfortable and asking a second question instead of answering your own. None of these are graded pedagogical reinventions. They're small decisions made on purpose. And they're the difference between a class that thinks together and a class that just watches the clock. If you try one thing before your next class, make it this. Do not open with the big question. Open with a door to it, a quick write, a low-stakes partner chat, a headline that makes someone ask, wait, does this affect me? In other words, build a ramp, not just the stage. If something in this episode made you rethink your next discussion prompt, or made you want to Google bulk sticker prices, follow the show and drop us a quick rating. It takes about 15 seconds, and it genuinely helps other educators find conversations like this one. If you know an instructor whose class discussion currently sounds like a refrigerator humming, send them this episode and consider it an act of professional kindness. I'm Marissa Bluestone, and this is the What and Who of EDU. We'll see you next time.